The day Jacob Weston fell off his horse in the middle of Main Street in Dry Creek, Texas, was the day every soul in town privately agreed that the old rancher had ridden his last good mile. It was the autumn of 1882, and the land around Dry Creek had been baked and cracked by a summer so relentless it seemed the sun itself had taken a personal grudge against everything that lived beneath it. The cattle were thin. The creek that gave the town its name had pulled back to a modest trickle threading between pale, sun-bleached stones. And Jacob Weston, who had once been the kind of man that other men pointed at when they wanted to illustrate what the word sturdy actually meant, had been shrinking by degrees all season long. He was 42 years old, which was not ancient by any civilized standard, but the West had a way of making a man old before the calendar ever caught up to him. Jacob had started ranching at 16, had survived a Comanche raid at 20, had buried a wife at 31, and had spent the 11 years since then pouring every remaining drop of himself into the 800 acres of shortgrass prairie that bore his name on the deed. The Weston Ranch was not the largest spread in Crockett County, but it was respectable, a 2-story house of rough-cut limestone, a good strong barn painted red, nearly 200 head of cattle, and a bunkhouse that slept 4 hands who had stayed loyal through seasons both fat and lean. But this past summer had taken something from Jacob that no amount of stubborn work could quite restore. A deep cough had moved into his chest in July and never fully left. His left knee, which had caught a horse's kick 3 winters back, had swollen up and made every step a negotiation. He had lost perhaps 15 pounds he could not afford to lose, and his face, always weather-browned and angular, had taken on a gaunt, hollowed look that made his blue eyes seem larger than they used to be, as if they were trying to compensate for the rest of him pulling inward. So when his horse, a steady roan named Copper, stepped sideways at a barrel being rolled across the street outside Harding's Mercantile, and Jacob's weakened grip on the saddle failed him, and he came down hard onto the packed dirt of Main Street, the 3 men who witnessed it exchanged a look that said everything none of them were willing to say aloud. Pete Dawes, his foreman, got to him first, crouching down and gripping Jacob's arm. "Boss, you all right?" Jacob sat up slowly, pressing his palm against the dirt. His hat had rolled 3 feet away, his knee was screaming, his pride was somewhere even farther off. "I am fine," he said in the particular tone of a man who is not fine but will go to his grave claiming otherwise. "You went down pretty clean," Pete said carefully. "Copper spooked." "He did, but you've been riding Copper for 6 years." "Get me up." Pete and the other man, a young hand named Calhoun, pulled Jacob to his feet. He retrieved his hat himself, brushed the dust from it with more deliberateness than the act required, and settled it back onto his head with the careful dignity of a man reasserting himself against the universe. He did not go back to the ranch right away. Instead, he tied Copper to the post in front of Dunmore's saloon, went inside, and sat at the bar with a glass of rye whiskey that he barely touched. Lottie Dunmore, who had run the place since her husband passed and who had known Jacob for 15 years, set the glass down in front of him and did not say a single word about the dirt still on his shoulder, because she understood that some men needed kindness to come in the shape of silence. Jacob sat there in the cool dimness and looked at his hands on the bar. The knuckles were swollen. The left one had a tremor he had first noticed in August and had been refusing to think about since. He was 42 years old, and his body was beginning to read like a bill of debts finally come due. He had, he thought with a bleak sort of clarity, maybe 1 good season left in him at this pace. 1 more hard winter, 1 more branding season, 1 more stretch of riding fence lines in the rain. And after that, he did not know. He did not let himself think beyond that point, because the thing beyond that point was not a thing he was ready to look at. He rode home in the late afternoon with the orange light lying flat across the prairie, and Copper walked steady beneath him, as if the horse understood that his rider needed gentleness just now. 3 days later, the stagecoach from San Angelo arrived in Dry Creek carrying 6 passengers, 4 bags of mail, a crate of dry goods for Harding's Mercantile, and one Edna Townsend. She came down from the coach with a carpet bag in one hand and a smaller leather satchel in the other, and she stood in the middle of the street and looked around at Dry Creek the way a person looks at something they are determined to make work whether it cooperates or not. She was 34 years old, with dark brown hair pinned up under a sensible hat, a straight-backed posture that she had cultivated through years of needing to take up exactly as much space as she was entitled to and no less, and gray eyes that saw things quickly and noted them without much fanfare. She was a widow. Her husband, Thomas Townsend, had been a schoolteacher in San Angelo who had died of typhoid fever 18 months ago, leaving her with a modest savings, no children, and the pressing need to make a decision about what her life was going to look like from this point forward. She had spent those 18 months grieving properly and thinking very carefully, and what she had arrived at was this: she needed work, she needed purpose, and she needed to be somewhere that needed her in return. She had answered an advertisement placed in the San Angelo Standard by the Dry Creek Town Council, seeking a teacher for the newly built schoolhouse. The school had been a project of considerable civic pride, funded partly by a land grant and partly by donations from the ranching families, and it had been standing empty for 5 months because finding a qualified teacher willing to come to a town of 340 people in the middle of the West Texas shortgrass was a project that tested the town's optimism considerably. Edna Townsend had a teaching certificate, 2 years of experience, and a practical understanding of hardship that made her unafraid of the kind of place Dry Creek was. She had written a letter, received one in return, and gotten on the stagecoach. The woman who met her was Clara Briggs, wife of the town's land agent, who served in an unofficial capacity as the person who organized everything that the town's official structures forgot to. Clara was a round-faced woman of 50 with an efficient warmth that expressed itself in action rather than sentiment. "Miss Townsend, or is it Mrs.?" Clara asked, taking the carpet bag from her hand before Edna had a chance to protest. "Mrs., though I don't much insist on it," Edna said. "Edna is fine." "Edna, good. I am Clara Briggs. The schoolhouse is 2 blocks that way, and your lodging is the room above the milliner's shop which Mrs. Hartley has kept very clean and which has a fine window facing east so you get good light in the mornings. Come along and I will show you both." Edna followed, looking at the town as she walked. It was small but not desperate. She had seen desperate, and this was not it. The buildings were real wood and stone, not false fronts. There was a church with a bell that actually worked, a blacksmith, a livery, a doctor's office, 2 dry goods stores, the saloon, and a handful of smaller establishments. The people she passed either nodded at her with curiosity or stepped aside with the cautious politeness reserved for newcomers who had not yet been sorted into the town's understanding of itself. The schoolhouse was a single square room with 8 rows of benches, a good iron stove in the corner, a chalkboard that ran the full length of the front wall, and windows on both sides that would make the room bright even on overcast days. Edna stood in the middle of it and felt something ease inside her chest that she had not realized was tight. "It is a good room," she said. 23 children registered, Clara told her. Ages 6 to 14. Most of the ranch families, some of the town families. "I think you will find the children eager enough. Some of them have had no schooling worth mentioning." "That is all right," Edna said. "We will start where they are." She opened the school on a Monday in late September, and within a week she had established herself in the town's consciousness as someone who knew what she was doing and was not going to be moved from it. The children, who had initially tested her in the way children always test someone new, discovered quickly that Mrs. Townsend was neither a pushover nor a tyrant, but something more interesting than either. She was genuinely curious about what they knew and what they thought, and she made the act of learning feel less like obligation and more like the solution to a puzzle they had not known they were interested in solving. She met Jacob Weston for the first time on a Wednesday in the first week of October, which was the day that 4 of his ranch hand's children were enrolled in her school by their fathers. And Jacob came along to sign the papers, because the hands were his responsibility in the broad way that everything on the Weston ranch was his responsibility. He came into the schoolhouse in the late afternoon after the children had gone, hat in hand, and stopped just inside the door the way a large man stops in a small room assessing it, deciding how to be in it without disturbing anything. Edna was erasing the chalkboard with her back to him and heard the door and turned. Her first impression of him was that he had clearly once been a very imposing man and was in the process of fighting against something that was trying to reduce him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that still held their shape even as the flesh beneath them had thinned. His face was the face of someone who spent every day outside and had done so for decades. He had blue eyes that were sharp and watchful and carried in them the particular quality of intelligence that does not always make itself known through words. He looked, she thought, tired in the way that went past sleep, the kind of tired that lived in the architecture of a person. "Jacob Weston," he said. "I have 4 of my hand's children enrolled, came to sign whatever needs signing." "Edna Townsend," she said, setting down the eraser and coming to the desk where she kept the enrollment register. "I appreciate you coming in. I like to know the family situations of my students. It helps me understand them. Pete Dawes has 2 Thomas and Anna. Calhoun's boy is Samuel. Hector Ray's has a daughter, Maria. Good kids, all of them. A bit rough around the edges, but they're not mean about it." She liked that he distinguished between rough and mean. She wrote the names and looked up. "Are they yours to look after in a practical sense, these children? Their mothers?" "Pete's wife passed last spring. Calhoun is not married. Ray's has a wife, good woman, does not speak much English, but she is sharp as a tack." He paused. "I suppose in a practical sense, yes. What happens on my land is my concern." She studied him for a moment with the same direct attention she gave to everything. "You look like you have had a difficult summer, Mr. Weston." He was visibly surprised by the directness of it. Most people in Dry Creek had been too careful to say anything like that to him, which was a kindness he had been finding suffocating. That obvious. To someone who pays attention. "Sit down if you would like. I can make coffee. I keep a pot on the stove." He sat, mostly because his knee was aching, and partly because something about the offer felt like the first genuinely natural thing anyone had offered him in months. She brought 2 cups and sat across from him, not behind the desk, but in one of the student chairs pulled up to face his, which put them on the same level and seemed to be a deliberate choice. "My chest got bad this summer," he said, which was more than he usually told anyone. "And my knee, and a few other things." "Have you seen the doctor? Doc Hennessy told me to rest." He said the word the way a man says a word that has no application to his life. "And you have not. The cattle don't rest." "The cattle," she said, "would survive a week without you." She said it without cruelty, just as a fact being presented for consideration. He looked at her for a moment. "You have not been in this town a week, and you are already telling me how to run my ranch." "I am not telling you how to run your ranch. I am pointing out that you are the kind of man who will work himself past the point of recovery and then be no use to anyone, including the cattle." She took a sip of coffee. "I recognize the type because my father was one." There was a silence. It was not an uncomfortable one. "What happened to your father?" he asked. "He died at 51 from overwork and stubbornness in equal measure," she said simply. "I miss him very much." Jacob looked down at his coffee cup. Something about the way she said it, without self-pity but with clear, clean grief, made the back of his throat tighten unexpectedly. "My wife died 11 years ago," he said. He had not planned to say that, but it came out anyway, as if the honesty of the room demanded it. "Fever. She was 28. "I am sorry," Edna said. Not in the automatic way that people said it, but with the weight of someone who understood exactly what the loss of a person meant. "Your husband?" he asked. "Typhoid. 18 months ago. He was a good man." "A schoolteacher, actually. I suppose that is partly why I went into it. I wanted to continue something of what he believed in." Jacob nodded slowly. He finished his coffee and stood, and she stood with him, and they walked to the door together without quite planning to. The afternoon light outside was golden and long, the way October light in West Texas could be, and it fell across the doorway and made the dust in the air look like something deliberate. "Mrs. Townsend," he said, putting his hat on. "Edna," she said, "you said my name was fine and I meant it both ways." Something moved in his face that was almost a smile. "Edna, then, thank you for the coffee. Come and tell me how the children are getting on," she said. "I find that the people who care about children are usually the most useful ones to talk to about them." He looked at her a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he touched the brim of his hat and went to where Copper was tied, and he rode back toward his ranch with the golden light at his back, and he could not have explained precisely why he felt, for the first time in a very long while, that the world had slightly more in it than it had seemed to that morning. He came back the following Wednesday. This time it was not about the children specifically, or rather, it began that way. He reported that Samuel Calhoun had apparently already learned to read 3 words that he had not known before, and that Maria Reyes had come home and taught her mother the English word for window, which had caused a small happiness in the Reyes household that Hector had mentioned at supper and could not stop smiling about. Jacob relayed these things standing in the doorway, and then Edna asked him if he had eaten, and he had not, and she had bread and dried beef, and 2 apples from a barrel that the Briggs family had shared with her, and they sat together at the teacher's desk as the light outside went from gold to deep amber to the early purple of evening. He told her about the ranch, the work of it, the particular satisfaction of watching a calf born in the cold and grow through the spring into something strong and useful, the way the land looked from the east ridge in the early morning when the light came across the grass and everything seemed possible. She listened in the way she listened to everything, with complete attention, and asked questions that were not surface questions, not "how many acres?" but "what is the thing about it that you could not give up?" He thought about that. "The quiet," he said finally, "not silence. The prairie is never silent. But there is a quality of the quiet there in the early morning that I have not found anywhere else. It feels like the world before anyone has made a mistake in it yet." She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "That is a beautiful way to say it," she said. "I am not usually a man for saying things that way." "You could be," she said, "if you let yourself." He went home that night with the stars enormous above him and Copper walking steady in the dark, and he was aware of a warmth in his chest that was not the cough in fact. The cough had been quieter today, which he noted, and then immediately told himself meant nothing. October moved through its middle weeks with a clarity of sky that West Texas could produce in autumn like a gift after the punishment of summer. The days were still warm enough in the afternoons, but the nights had begun to genuinely cool, and there was a crispness in the morning air that Jacob felt in his knee but also in his lungs, and his lungs seemed to be working better with it. He began seeing Edna with a regularity that was not quite courtship yet. It lacked the formal structure that courtship in 1882 required, but that everyone in Dry Creek noticed and filed away with the particular quiet satisfaction of a town that had been worrying about Jacob Weston for some months and was now feeling that perhaps things were turning. Clara Briggs said nothing to Edna directly for 3 weeks, which for Clara was an extraordinary exercise of restraint. And then one evening when she brought Edna a jar of preserved peaches, she sat down at the small table in Edna's room above the milliner's and said, "Jacob Weston is a good man." "I know," Edna said. "He has been very alone since Eleanor died. He works himself into the ground and calls it living. I have noticed. He needs someone who is not afraid of him." "Most people are not afraid of him," Edna said, pouring tea. "They are just careful with him, which is not the same thing but which looks the same from the outside and probably feels the same to him." Clara looked at her with appreciation. "You are a sharp woman, Edna Townsend." "I am a practical one," Edna said. "Sharp sounds like a criticism dressed as a compliment." Clara laughed, which she did not do frequently, and left the peaches and went home. And Edna sat in her east-facing window in the lamplight and thought about Jacob Weston with more intention than she had allowed herself to do before. She had liked him from the first day. That was just a fact. She had liked his directness, and the way he was clearly fighting something, and refusing to acknowledge that he might need help fighting it. And she had liked that he distinguished between rough and mean. And she had liked the way he talked about the morning quiet on the prairie, as if it were a sacred thing he had been entrusted with rather than a piece of land he merely owned. But she was also practical. She was 34 years old, and she had been married and widowed, and she was not going to make a decision about her heart the way a young girl might, on the basis of feeling alone. She was going to pay attention, as she paid attention to everything, and let the evidence accumulate and tell her what it meant. What the evidence was telling her, by the third week of October, was that she was looking forward to Wednesday afternoons in a way that was affecting her ability to focus on Friday afternoons. Jacob, for his part, was experiencing something he did not have good language for because he had not needed this language in 11 years. He would be working mending fence, sorting cattle, supervising the hands at morning feeding, and find his mind drifting east toward town, toward the square schoolhouse, toward a woman with gray eyes who told him things directly and made coffee, and asked him questions that required actual thought to answer. He would catch himself and apply his mind back to whatever task was in front of him, but the drift would happen again, and eventually he stopped fighting it and just let it happen, the way you eventually stop fighting a river current and start swimming with it. In the last week of October, he asked if she would like to ride out to the East Ridge on Sunday morning. He had thought about asking for 5 days before he actually asked. He had rehearsed and discarded a dozen versions of the question. When he finally said it, standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse with his hat in his hands after the Wednesday visit, it came out plainly. "I would like to show you what I was talking about, the morning quiet, if you wanted to see it." She looked at him steadily. "I do not ride very well," she said. "I have a gentle horse, a bay mare named Nell." "She will not give you any trouble." "Then yes," Edna said, "I would like that." He picked her up before sunrise on Sunday, which in late October was not unreasonably early, around 6 o'clock, and she was waiting on the street outside the milliner's in a practical riding skirt and her sensible hat, and she looked up at the dark blue sky with the stars still fading in it, and she said, "I can already see why you like the mornings." He helped her up onto Nell, who was as gentle as promised, and they rode out of town on the wagon road and then turned north along the fence line of his property. And by the time they reached the East Ridge, the sky had begun its transformation. That slow, extraordinary process by which the Texas sky in autumn went from deep blue to a pale greenish light along the horizon to the first gold, and then the full burning orange of the sun actually arriving. And the shortgrass prairie stretched out below them in every direction, and the light moved across it like something alive. Jacob sat on Copper beside her and watched her watching it. She was quiet for a long time. He was quiet too. The prairie spoke for both of them, the rustle of the dry grass, the distant low of a cow, the first calls of the meadowlark settling into the morning. The air smelled of sage and cooling earth. "I understand now," she said softly. "The world before anyone has made a mistake in it." He felt the warmth in his chest that was not the cough. They sat on that ridge for nearly an hour, talking sometimes and not talking at other times with equal comfort, and Jacob noticed that the ease of the silence with her was not a thing he had experienced with many people. With most people, silence required management. With Edna, it simply existed between them like a piece of shared landscape. She asked him about Alina. He had not expected that question but found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he wanted to answer it. He told her that Alina had been full of laughter, that she had been the kind of woman who made every room she was in a place people wanted to be, that her death had taken the laughter out of the ranch house in a way that 11 years had not fully repaired. He told it plainly, without theater, and Edna listened and then said, "She sounds like she was exactly right for you when you needed her, and what you need now may be something different, and that is not a betrayal of her." He looked at her. The morning light was fully established now, warm and golden on her face. "You say things very directly," he said. "I find it saves time," she said. "Yes," he said, "it does." They rode back to town, and he left her at the milliner's, and she went up to her room and stood at her east-facing window with her hand on the glass, and acknowledged to herself that the evidence had reached a conclusion. And the conclusion was that she was falling in love with Jacob Weston, who had one good season left in his body, unless someone made him believe otherwise. November came in with a cold front that swept down from the north and changed everything overnight. The cattle needed constant attention, moving them toward the lower pastures where they were sheltered from the worst wind, breaking ice in the water troughs each morning, checking the weakest calves. Jacob drove himself through it the way he always had, and his cough came back with the cold air, though it was not quite as bad as it had been in the deep of summer. Edna noticed. She noticed because she was paying attention. On the second Sunday of November, she appeared at the Weston ranch. She had borrowed a wagon from Tom Briggs, who had offered it without comment because Clara had suggested he do so, and she drove it herself the 4 miles from town with a basket in the back that contained a pot of beef stew she had made that morning, a loaf of bread from Mrs. Hartley's kitchen, and 3 jars of the medicine that Doc Hennessy had prescribed for Jacob's cough in August, and which Pete Dawes had quietly told her Jacob had not been taking because he kept forgetting to refill it. Jacob came out of the barn when he heard the wagon. He was in his work clothes, covered in hay and the general indignities of a cold morning's labor, and he looked at her standing in his yard with her basket, and his first expression was surprise and his second was something that was trying very hard not to be joy. "You drove out here yourself," he said. "Borrowing a wagon was not complicated," she said. "In November, alone. The road is straight and the horse knows it." She held up the basket. "Doc Hennessy told me what he prescribed for you. I brought the refill." He looked at the basket, and then at her, and something in his face shifted, like a wall that had been standing so long it had forgotten it was a wall, and was now remembering there might be something on the other side worth seeing. "You should not have to," he started. "Jacob," she said, in the tone of someone who is going to say this once and then move past it. "You are a stubborn man who takes care of everyone in his orbit except himself, and if I do not occasionally intervene, you are going to work yourself into the ground before spring. I am not prepared to let that happen. Now are you going to invite me inside, or are we going to stand in your yard until we both freeze?" There was a pause. Pete Dawes was visible at the barn door, watching with an expression of pure delight carefully disguised as interest in a loose board. "Come inside," Jacob said. The ranch house was exactly what she had imagined from his descriptions of it, built solid, furnished practically, warm from the big iron stove in the kitchen, with the particular spare quality of a house that has been run by a man alone for a long time. There was order to it. Jacob was not a chaotic man, but no decoration except for a small framed daguerreotype on the mantel that she understood immediately was a leaner, and she glanced at it and then respectfully did not look at it again, because this was not the moment for that. She put the stew on the stove to warm and set out the bread and placed the medicine jars on the kitchen table and told him he was to take it morning and night without skipping. He sat in the kitchen chair that was clearly his chair, the one worn smooth in exactly the right places, and watched her move around his kitchen with an expression that he was not even trying to hide anymore, which Edna noticed and noted and carefully did not remark upon, because some things needed to arrive in their own time. Pete came in for lunch and found them at the table with the stew and was so visibly pleased that he had to manufacture a reason to go back outside almost immediately. And young Calhoun came in after him and said, "Mrs. Townsend," with such surprised happiness that everyone laughed, and the house had laughter in it for the first time in a long while. She stayed until mid-afternoon and drove back to town as the light was beginning to deepen, and Jacob stood at the edge of the yard and watched her go. And when the wagon had disappeared around the bend in the road, he stood there for another minute in the cold wind and felt something he recognized, distantly, as the feeling of being alive in a way that required something from you. He took the medicine that evening. He took it the next morning. He took it every morning and evening after that. By the end of November, his cough had quieted to something occasional and manageable, and Doc Hennessy, who saw him at church on the first Sunday of December, stopped him afterward and said quietly, "You look considerably better than you did in October, Jacob." "Cold weather agrees with me," Jacob said. "That's one theory," Doc Hennessy said, and did not pursue the other one. Jacob had been thinking about how to proceed. He had been thinking about it with the same methodical care he applied to any significant decision, looking at all the variables, estimating the risks, trying to account for the things he could not see. What he arrived at, after considerable internal deliberation, was the conclusion that he was 42 years old, and he had spent 11 years deciding not to want things beyond the ranch and the cattle and the daily maintenance of being alive, and that this had been sensible given the circumstances and was now, equally sensibly, no longer the right approach. He also arrived at the conclusion that Edna Townsend was not a woman you approached with anything less than complete honesty, because she would see through anything less and would think the worse of you for trying it. So on the second Saturday of December, he went to her room above the milliner's, went to the front door and knocked properly, and Mrs. Hartley let him in and called up the stairs, and Edna came down to the small sitting room that Mrs. Hartley maintained for the use of her lodger receiving callers, and Mrs. Hartley made a strategic appearance of having business elsewhere. Edna sat across from him in the lamplight, her hands folded in her lap, watching him with those gray eyes that saw everything. "I have been thinking," Jacob said. "I know," she said. "How do you know?" "Because you come to the schoolhouse on Wednesdays now and Saturdays as well, and when you arrived yesterday you looked like a man who had made a decision and was preparing to say it out loud." He looked at her. "You are the most perceptive person I have met in a very long time." "I pay attention," she said. "What is the decision?" He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, turning his hat in his hands in the way he did when he was working something out. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If that is something you would consider, I am not." He paused. "I want to be honest with you about what I am. I am 42 years old and my body has been through considerable weather. I have a ranch that takes most of what I have. I have not been particularly good at being a person who lets people in since a leaner, and I am aware that what I am offering is not a young man's offer." Edna was quiet for a moment, looking at him with that direct, clear attention. "Jacob," she said, "I am 34 years old and I have been widowed and I have moved across the state to start over in a town I did not know. I am not looking for a young man's offer. I am looking for a true one." She paused. "And I think you know that what you have been offering for the past 6 weeks, in the form of Wednesday visits and Sunday mornings on the ridge and conversations about what things mean rather than just what they are, I think you know that has already been a true offer. You are only now naming it." He looked at her for a long moment, and then something in him, that last held-back thing, that piece of reserve that had been in place for 11 years, released. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him take it, and they sat like that in the lamplight with the December wind outside and nothing needing to be said for a while. He courted her through December and into the new year of 1883 with a combination of steadiness and a genuine eagerness that surprised even himself. He brought her things from the ranch, a bundle of dried sage that he thought she might like the smell of, which she kept on her windowsill, and a wolf pelt he had tanned himself, soft as anything, that he hung on her wall because the room was cold in the mornings. He took her to Christmas services at the church and sat beside her in the pew, and when she sang the hymns, clearly and without self-consciousness, in a true alto that he had not heard before, he sat very still and listened, and thought that he had not known until that moment that there were still things capable of surprising him. She brought him things too. In the practical way, she had books she thought he would like, because she had established that he read when his hands allowed it. A pair of good wool gloves she had knitted herself during the evenings in her room, which fit him perfectly because she had measured his hands without him knowing she was measuring them. She came to the ranch on Sundays, and eventually she was teaching Maria Reyes and Anna Dawes to bake bread in the ranch kitchen on Sunday afternoons, while Jacob and Pete sat at the table and talked through the week's work. And the house was full of the smell of baking and the sound of women and children. And it was so different from what the house had been for 11 years that Jacob sometimes had to go outside for a minute, just to let himself feel it without being seen feeling it. The children at the school adored her absolutely by January. Samuel Calhoun, who had started in October unable to read a word, was reading sentences by Christmas. Thomas Dawes, who was 12 and testing the outer limits of what school could hold him, had been set the project of drawing a detailed map of the county from survey records, and had become so absorbed in it that his behavior had transformed from sullen resistance to something approaching genuine investment. Maria Reyes, who was 10 and ferociously bright, was doing arithmetic that belonged to a child 2 years older. These things made Jacob feel, in a complicated and not entirely explainable way, that Edna Townsend was part of the Weston ranch even before she officially was, because the children she was teaching were the children of his land, and what she gave them was something he could not have given them, and it mattered. He proposed on a Saturday in late January, and he did it on the East Ridge at sunrise, which was the truest place he knew. He had thought about the words for 2 weeks. When he was actually standing there beside her with the winter sky going from silver to rose to gold above the frozen prairie, all the prepared words left him, and what came out instead was, "I love you. I am going to love you for as long as I am standing, and after that too. I would like for you to be my wife." Edna turned from the sunrise to look at him. Her cheeks were cold-reddened and her breath made small clouds in the morning air, and she was looking at him the way she looked at the things she had decided were true. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He kissed her then, the first time, with the winter sun just clearing the horizon and the prairie golden below them. And it was not a young man's kiss, but it was a true one. It had everything in it that they both were, the grief and the years and the long patience and the thing that was now new between them, alive and certain. They rode back to town and told Clara Briggs first, because not telling Clara first would have been both cruel and strategically unwise, and Clara wept with a directness that was somehow entirely consistent with her character, and then immediately began organizing the wedding, because someone had to. They were married on a Saturday in the last week of March, 1883, in the church, with the whole town of Dry Creek in attendance, because there was not a person in the town who did not feel some stake in this event. The children from the school sat in a block of benches on the left side and were absolutely perfect for 45 minutes, which was a record. Pete Dawes stood up for Jacob, and Clara Briggs stood up for Edna, and Doc Hennessy sat in the front row and noted that Jacob Weston looked healthier than he had in 3 years, which he filed away with private satisfaction. Edna wore a dress the color of cream with a collar of blue that matched, people would later say, the color that Jacob's eyes went when he was happy. Jacob wore his best coat and his one good pair of dress boots, and had shaved so closely that Pete had asked him twice if he was feeling all right. He stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle toward him, and his face did something that the people of Dry Creek would talk about for years, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so purely and simply the face of a man who has, against considerable odds, been given back something he thought he had lost for good. The ceremony was spoken and quiet and certain. When the Reverend said the words, they both said theirs as if they meant every syllable, which they did. The reception was in the churchyard, because March in West Texas was mild enough, with tables of food brought by every family in town, and fiddle music from two of the Weston ranch hands who turned out to be excellent players, and dancing until the stars were fully out. Jacob danced with Edna, who was not a practiced dancer but was a willing one, and she laughed when she missed a step and he caught her and said, low and against her ear, "I have got you." And she tilted her head back and looked up at him with those gray eyes and said, "I know you do." And the fiddle played on and the stars were very bright. Edna moved into the ranch house the following Monday. She had been practical about it, as she was about everything. She kept the school teaching, because the school needed her and she needed the work of it, and she drove herself to school in the wagon 3 days a week, and on the other days Pete or Calhoun took the children in. The ranch house, which had been spare and functional, began gently to become something else, not because Edna swept in and remade it, but because a house changes when it is being lived in by two people who are paying attention to each other. She put up curtains, blue ones, because she liked blue and because the color made the limestone walls warmer. She put a tablecloth on the kitchen table. She hung a shelf for her books on the wall beside the fireplace, and Jacob's books gradually migrated there too, and the shelf became a shared thing without either of them deciding it would be. She moved Aliner's daguerreotype from the mantel to a small table in the hallway where it could be seen and honored, but was not the first thing in every room. And Jacob noticed this one evening and stood looking at it and said nothing for a moment and then said, "That is the right place for it." And Edna put her hand on his back and said nothing at all, which was also the right thing. Spring came in properly in April, and the ranch woke up with it calving season, which was the busiest and most necessary time, when Jacob and the hands worked from before dawn until after dark, and the air smelled of new grass and the particular clean cold of spring mornings. Edna learned the rhythms of it, learned that during calving she would not see much of Jacob until evening, and that when he came in he would be too tired for conversation, but would sit with her by the fire, and let her presence be the thing that restored him, which she understood and was content with. She also learned the ranch itself, learned the names of the cattle that had names, learned which of the horses had which temperaments, learned that the barn had a loose board on the south side that Pete had been meaning to fix since October 1881, learned that the water in the well closest to the house was sweeter than the one by the barn. She learned these things by paying attention, and Jacob noticed her learning them, and each thing she knew about his land made him feel in some way that his land was being honored. His health continued to improve through the spring in a way that was remarkable enough that Doc Hennessy said so directly when he came out to look at old Hector raise his wrist in April and stopped by the main house for coffee. "I do not know if it is the medicine or the marriage or the spring air," the doctor said, "but you look like a different man than the one who fell off copper last October, Jacob." "I did not fall," Jacob said automatically, and Edna said, "You did," from across the room without looking up from what she was reading, and Doc Hennessy laughed and Jacob shook his head and drank his coffee. "The medicine helped," Jacob admitted. "And the rest?" He glanced across the room at Edna, who was still reading, and his expression was the one that was becoming his characteristic expression now, that look of someone who has been given more than they expected and is still slightly in disbelief of it. "It is not the medicine," Doc Hennessy said quietly to him. Jacob said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. By summer, the ranch was having one of its better seasons in recent memory. The rains came at the right intervals, the grass grew lush in the lower pastures, the calving losses had been the lowest in 3 years, and the beef prices in San Angelo were good. Jacob drove a herd of 60 head to market in June, and came back with more money than he had seen from a single sale in several years, and he stood in the kitchen with the bank draft in his hand, and felt something he recognized as straightforward gladness, uncomplicated by exhaustion. He bought Edna a new horse, not a borrowed gentle mare but her own, a steady gray with a blaze on her nose that Edna named Patience, because she said that was what the horse's expression communicated. He had it waiting for her on a Sunday morning when she came out to the porch. And when she saw it, she turned and looked at him with such an unguarded expression of happiness that he had to look away for a moment. "Jacob Weston," she said. "You have been borrowing horses for 6 months," he said. "That seems like enough of that." She went to the horse and put her forehead against its neck and said something to it too quietly for him to hear, and then she came back and took his face in both her hands and kissed him in the full morning light in the yard where Pete and Calhoun could very well see them, which neither of them cared about at all. In August of 1883, Edna told Jacob she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen in the evening after supper, sitting across from him at the table with the lamp between them, and she watched his face go through a sequence of things: first stillness, then something that was very close to fear, and then, as she continued to look at him steadily with the clear gray eyes that never hid what they knew, the fear was replaced by something else, something large and quiet and true. "Are you all right?" he said. His voice was careful. "I mean, are you healthy?" "Are you?" "I am perfectly healthy," she said. "Doc Hennessy confirmed it yesterday. He says I am as sound as the morning. He said that. He said that." Jacob reached across the table and took her hands. She could feel a slight tremor in his left one, which she had made peace with early on. It was not worsening, which was what mattered. He held her hands and looked at her, and his blue eyes were bright. "I am 43 years old," he said quietly. "I know how old you are," she said. "I thought," he started. "I know what you thought," she said. "You thought you had one good season left in your body. You thought that was the honest accounting." She squeezed his hands. "But you are not accounting correctly. You have been taking your medicine and sleeping enough and eating regularly and letting people help you, and you are stronger now than you were a year ago, and you are going to be a father, and that is a reason to be stronger still." He sat for a long time holding her hands. Outside, the summer night made its sounds: crickets in the grass, a horse shifting in the barn, the distant call of a nighthawk. "I am scared," he said, which was one of the truest things he had ever said out loud. "So am I," she said. "But we are going to do it anyway, because that is what we do." He brought her hands up and pressed them against his face, against his jaw, and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked at her with everything visible, no reserve, no wall. "I love you," he said. "I love you too," she said. "Now go tell Pete that there is going to be a Weston who does not know how to ride a horse yet, and watch his face." Jacob laughed, a full, real laugh, and went out to the bunkhouse, and Edna sat in the lamplight in the kitchen of the house that was hers now and put her hand on her still flat belly and felt the future pressing gently forward. Pete's response was to whoop loud enough to bring Calhoun running from the outhouse, wondering what was happening, and Hector Reyes, when told the following morning, went immediately to his wife, and they had an animated discussion in Spanish that ended with Maria Reyes being sent to tell Edna that Ana Reyes wanted to help with whatever was needed, which was the form of congratulation that meant the most because it came with action. The pregnancy moved through its months without serious difficulty. Edna taught school until November, by which point she had arranged for a woman named Bessie Turner, a minister's wife from a neighboring town who had taught school briefly before her marriage, to take over the classroom for the winter term. This was a source of considerable negotiation inside herself, because she was not easy about stepping back from the school, but she was practical about her body and its needs, and she made the arrangement with the council and gave Bessie Turner a 2-hour briefing on every student that was so detailed and thorough that Bessie reportedly said afterward that it was the most prepared she had felt in any professional situation. Jacob worried about her in the way that men who have lost a wife to fever worry about the people they love, which is to say, he worried constantly and tried to hide it and failed entirely to hide it. He was up before dawn every morning, and the first thing he did was check that she was breathing, standing in the bedroom door with his hand on the frame. And Edna knew he was doing this, and had decided that the loving thing was not to tell him she knew, because the fear was real and the checking was how he managed it. Doc Hennessy came to the ranch once a month through the winter and told Jacob every time that Edna was healthy and doing well, and Jacob received this information with the same controlled relief each time, as if he had not managed to fully trust the previous report. In January of 1884, a winter storm came down from the north that was one of the serious ones. 3 days of wind and snow that was extraordinary by West Texas standards, where hard winters were felt, but rarely saw this kind of sustained cold. The cattle had to be moved entirely to the lower shelter pasture, which took 2 full days of work by all 4 hands in conditions that were genuinely dangerous. Jacob went out with them, because he would not send his men into something he would not go into himself, and Edna let him go because she understood that this was the truth of who he was, and she had not married him to change that truth, but to be alongside it. She kept the stove going and made food for when they came back, and kept herself occupied with the mending pile that had been accumulating, and with the letters she was writing to the school board about the spring term curriculum, and she was not frightened for herself, though the storm sounded immense against the limestone walls. She was mildly frightened for Jacob, but she held that fear the way you hold something hot carefully, briefly, and then set it down. All 4 hands came back. The cattle survived with minimal losses. Jacob came in from the 3rd day of it looking like a man who had been in a fight with the sky and had come out slightly ahead, and he stood in the kitchen doorway covered in snow and ice and looked at her at the table, warm in the lamplight, and his face had that expression again, the particular one she had begun to think of as his truest face. "You are still here," he said. He always said something like that when he came in from the hard ones. "I will always still be here," she said. "Come inside and get warm." Their son was born on a clear, cold morning in February of 1884, in the ranch house, with Doc Hennessy present and Anna Reyes assisting, and Clara Briggs in the kitchen maintaining the supply of hot water and clean cloth with the military efficiency that was Clara's gift. Jacob was in the kitchen for most of it, occupying the space between the table and the window, and Pete Dawes sat with him for a while and said very little, which was the correct thing. The birth took 7 hours and was difficult in the middle of it. Difficult enough that there was a stretch of 2 hours when the sounds from the bedroom made Jacob go completely still and white in a way that Pete watched very carefully. But Doc Hennessy came out at the end of those 2 hours and said, "She is fine and he is fine, and you can come in now." And the weight that left Jacob's face was visible from across the room. The baby was round and red and furious about the world in the way of healthy newborns, and he had Jacob's blue eyes and Edna's dark hair. And Jacob held him in the kitchen light while Edna rested and looked down at him with an expression that seemed to have no language available for it. Just a man and his son in the morning. The world reorganized entirely. They named him Thomas, for Edna's late husband, which was Jacob's suggestion, offered quietly on their first full day together as a family of 3. Edna had looked at him when he said it with eyes that were full, and had said, "Are you certain?" And he had said, "A man who made you who you are deserves to be remembered." And that was the end of the question. Thomas Weston grew through his first year with the vigor of a child raised in good air and good love. He was not a quiet baby. He had opinions from very early on and expressed them without hesitation, which Edna said was a sign of a healthy character, and Jacob said was a sign of something he could see in the mirror every morning. He had the run of the ranch house by the time he could crawl and was on his feet, and exploring with dangerous confidence by 11 months, and Hector Reyes's daughter Maria appointed herself his unofficial guardian at this stage, and could often be found sitting on the kitchen floor with him while Edna was at the stove, teaching him Spanish words with the patient authority of a 10-year-old, who considers herself the most qualified person for any task she takes on. Edna went back to teaching in September of 1884 when Thomas was 7 months old, with Anna Reyes taking on the care of the baby during school hours in an arrangement that was mutually beneficial, and that had been Edna's idea, proposed to Anna in careful Spanish that Edna had been quietly learning since the previous spring. Anna Reyes's face when Edna asked her, the question formed carefully in her own language, was a thing that Clara Briggs, who happened to be present, said she would not forget. The school continued to grow. By the fall of 1884, there were 31 enrolled students, and Edna had petitioned the town council for an additional room to be built, arguing the case with the specific combination of educational reasoning and practical finance that she had learned was the most effective language with the council. The addition was approved in October. By spring it was built, and Dry Creek found itself in the unusual position for a town its size of having a two-room schoolhouse with a qualified teacher and a growing attendance. Jacob watched all of this with a particular quality of pride that was different from the pride he took in the ranch. That was a pride of effort, of years of work made visible. This was something else, a pride that came from witnessing a person doing what they were made to do and doing it fully, without apology or limitation. He told her once, sitting by the fire on a winter evening with Thomas asleep upstairs and the night very quiet, that the school was the second best thing she had built since she came to Dry Creek. She asked what the first was. He gestured at the room around them, the house, the life in it, the fire, the quiet. She sat for a while looking at the fire. Then she said, "You built most of this." "I built the walls," he said. "You made it a home." She reached over and put her hand on his arm, and they sat that way until the fire burned low. The years moved through the middle of the decade in the way that good years do, not without difficulty, because the West did not grant difficulty-free living to anyone regardless of their situation, but with the particular quality of years that are lived rather than merely survived. There were hard seasons, a dry summer in 1885 that required careful management, and a trip to the bank for a short-term note that Jacob hated taking out, paid back in full the following year. A horse was struck by lightning in 1886 and had to be put down, which affected Jacob more than he would admit because he had raised that horse from a foal. Pete Dawes remarried in 1885, a widow from Fort Stockton named Mabel who had 3 children of her own, and the Dawes household became a cheerful chaos that spread naturally to the main house and added to its general liveliness. Thomas grew from a furiously opinionated baby into a furiously opinionated child who was also, it became clear by the time he was 4, genuinely bright. The kind of bright that looked in all directions at once and needed to be channeled rather than contained. He had his father's stubbornness and his mother's directness, and a combination of both their humor that came out in ways that made Pete Dawes laugh so hard he had to leave the room. In the spring of 1886, Edna told Jacob she was expecting again. He received this news in a different way than the first time, not with fear but with a large, genuine, uncomplicated joy that he did not try to moderate. He picked her up, which surprised both of them because he had not done that before, and it was the kind of gesture that did not match the general restraint of his character. And she laughed, the real laugh, the one that came from the center of her, and he held her there in the kitchen in the afternoon light for a long moment before setting her down carefully and looking at her with all his love visible and undefended. "You are going to need to put me down before long," she said, "for obvious reasons." "I know," he said. He was still smiling. "Let me have this one for a minute." The second child was a girl, born in November of 1886, in the same room, with the same doctor and mostly the same company. Though this time Jacob came into the bedroom when she was first cleaning up and sat on the edge of the bed and held Edna's hand throughout the last of it, because he had decided after the experience of waiting in the kitchen that being present was better than being spared, and Edna had agreed with this entirely. They named her Clara, which Clara Briggs learned about 3 days later, and which produced the second crying episode of Clara's adult life in Edna's presence. And Clara said firmly that she was not crying because she was surprised. She was crying because she was honored. And those were different things. And Edna said that she understood the distinction perfectly. Clara Weston was quieter than her brother, more observant, more inclined to watch a thing fully before engaging with it. Jacob said she had her mother's eyes and her mother's mind, and Edna said she had her father's patience, and both of them were right. Thomas adored her with the absolute and sometimes overwhelming devotion of a firstborn child for a younger sibling, and Clara tolerated this devotion with a serenity that was remarkable in a baby and increasingly characteristic as she grew. Pete Dawes, watching Jacob Weston in the fall of 1886 with a healthy wife and 2 children and a ranch in the best shape it had been in a decade, said to Mabel one evening, "You know, 3 years ago I honestly thought we were going to lose him before winter was out. Not to anything particular. Just the life going out of him, piece by piece." Mabel, who had a good, direct understanding of people, said, "What changed?" Pete considered this. "She did," he said. "She came, and he just started believing the mornings were worth getting up for again." Mabel said that was about the most succinct thing she had ever heard her husband say, and she was going to write it down. The decade continued forward with the confidence of something that has found its correct path. In 1888, Jacob expanded the herd, bought 30 additional head from a ranch over in Sutton County that was being broken up, and the pasture work that spring was the most demanding the Weston hands had undertaken in years. But the ranch grew into a shape that Jacob had been imagining for a long time. He brought on 2 additional hands, both young men, one the son of a family from Fort Stockton, and one a Mexican-American man named Diego Alvarez, whose horsemanship was exceptional, and who Hector Reyes greeted on his first day with an extended conversation in Spanish that ended in a handshake of the warm, solid kind that means more than its surface. Jacob was 50 years old in 1890, which he acknowledged on the morning of his birthday by standing on the front porch in the early light and looking out at the prairie, which was green from a good spring rain, and saying to no one in particular, "Well." And then Edna came out with coffee and stood beside him, and he told her what he was thinking about, which was the 20-year-old version of himself that had arrived on this land with nothing but a determination to make it matter, and the 42-year-old version who had fallen off his horse and sat alone in the saloon with a barely touched rye and thought he was running out of time. "You were running out of time," Edna said, leaning against the porch rail with her coffee. "The way you were going, you were." "I know," he said, and now he looked at the prairie. Thomas was visible at the barn door, arguing with a calf about something. Clara was at the kitchen window, watching them on the porch with her calm, observant expression. "And now I feel like I am at the beginning of something," he said, which at 50 is a peculiar thing to say. "Not peculiar at all," Edna said. "You just started late." He looked at her, the 42-year-old woman who had gotten on a stagecoach in San Angelo and remade the world, though she would say she had only turned up and paid attention. She was in her teaching dress, the gray one with the small collar, and her dark hair had silver in it now along the temples, and her gray eyes were exactly as clear and direct as they had been on the day she had told him he looked like he had had a difficult summer. "What are you looking at?" she said. "You," he said. "I am always looking at you." She looked back at him with the expression that was her version of everything she felt, not grand, not theatrical, just true and present and undefended. "Happy birthday," she said. "Now come inside and eat before Thomas discovers that a calf has escaped the pen and spends the morning in a general panic." He came inside, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and biscuits and the particular warmth of a house that has been a home for years, and Clara helped him set the table while Edna made the gravy with the precise economy of motion that she brought to everything, and Thomas came in red-faced and slightly out of breath to report that the calf was fine. He had sorted it out, and Pete said he had done it very competently for a 6-year-old, which Thomas received as a significant compliment. They sat down together at the kitchen table, Jacob and Edna and Thomas and Clara, and Pete and Mabel and their combined children came over mid-morning because Mabel had made a cake, and Hector Reyes and Anna came at noon because Anna had made tamales, and by midday the front porch in the yard had the quality of a celebration, not a planned one but the kind that assembles itself naturally around a life that has been lived well enough to draw people to it. Jacob sat on the porch in the afternoon with the noise of it around him, and thought about the East Ridge and the morning quiet and the prairie before anyone had made a mistake in it. He thought about what Edna had given him, not just the love, though the love was everything, but the belief, extended consistently and without drama, that he was worth giving more years to. That the body and the spirit both had more to give than the accounting of a bad summer could reveal. That a man of 42 who had fallen off his horse in the dirt of Main Street was not at the end of anything but was, possibly, at the beginning of the part that mattered most. He had believed himself to have one good season left in his body. She had turned up and given him 10 more. And here he was, on his 50th birthday in the fall of 1890, with a strong ranch and strong children and a woman who saw him completely and had decided, on the basis of that complete seeing, to stay, and the 10th year was not the last one. He was sure of it. There was too much still to do, too much still to see. Thomas would need to be taught the ranch with the full patience and rigor that a Weston applied to important things. Clara would need to be given every possible tool for the fierce, clear intelligence she was growing into. The school needed an addition again. Edna had already drawn up the petition. Diego Alvarez had shown a real facility for the stock management side of things, and Jacob had been thinking for 2 years about what it meant to run a ranch where the men who worked it had real stakes in its success. There was too much still to do to stop now. He was just going to have to keep going. He found Edna at the end of the afternoon standing at the fence line looking out at the lower pasture, where the late afternoon light was lying long and golden across the grass. He came and stood beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. "Good birthday," she said. "The best one I can remember," he said, "though I think I said that last year." "You did, and the year before." "Then I have been consistently right." She laughed, that real central laugh. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder just briefly, the way she did sometimes, not a dramatic gesture but a present one, a statement of location. "I am here beside you and this is where I intend to be." He put his arm around her. The cattle moved slowly in the lower pasture. The light was doing the thing it did in fall, that long orange thing, that light like a benediction across the grass. The years were going to keep coming, Jacob thought. They were going to come one after another the way they always had, each one with its difficulties and its gifts, its bad patches and its clear mornings, its losses and its compensations. He was going to be in them. He was going to be in them for a long time yet, and she was going to be beside him, paying attention. In the spring of 1891, Thomas was 7 and showing the first clear signs of the rancher he was going to become. He had a natural understanding of the animals that went beyond instruction, an instinct for reading the cattle's behavior that Jacob recognized because he had grown up with it himself. He began teaching his son formally, the way his own father had taught him, taking him out on the morning rounds and explaining as they went, asking questions rather than just giving answers. Thomas asked questions back, many of them. The questions ranged from the technically excellent to the philosophically surprising, and Jacob answered each one with the full attention they deserved, because he had learned from Edna that the questions children ask are the most reliable map of who they are going to be. Clara, at 4, had begun reading. This was Edna's doing. She had begun the letters in the fall, treating it as a game, and Clara had absorbed the whole alphabet in 3 weeks and moved immediately into words and then sentences with an efficiency that even Edna found impressive. By spring, she was reading the simple readers that Edna kept from school, and she read them with the focused absorption of a person who has found the thing their brain was specifically designed for. Jacob found her one afternoon sitting on the porch with a book in her lap, spelling out something to herself quietly. He sat down beside her carefully because the knee still made its opinion known after long days, and she showed him what she was reading, a natural history book about the animals of the Southwest that Edna had ordered from a catalog, and read him a passage about the habits of roadrunners with a seriousness that he found entirely charming. "Mama says roadrunners eat snakes," Clara said. "They do," Jacob confirmed. "That seems brave." It does, he agreed. Clara considered this. I want to be that brave, she said. You will be, Jacob said. She went back to her book, and Jacob sat on the porch of his ranch house in the spring sunshine and thought, yes, yes to all of it. Yes to the years ahead and the ones already spent. Yes to the woman inside who was grading papers at the kitchen table with the same focused attention she gave to everything. Yes to the son at the barn learning the morning work, and the daughter on the porch reading about brave birds and the hands who had stayed and the land that had given back what was put into it. He had thought once, with the clear-eyed honesty of a man sitting alone in a saloon with a barely touched drink, that he was running out. That the body had one good season left in it, and then the accounting would come due. He had been wrong. Not because the body had been wrong. The body had been telling the truth about what was happening to it on the trajectory it was on. He had been wrong about the trajectory. She had changed the trajectory. She had walked off a stagecoach in the fall of 1882 with a carpet bag and a pair of gray eyes, and the firm conviction that paying attention was both the simplest and the most radical thing a person could do. And she had looked at him, fully, directly, without flinching, and decided that he was worth more years than he had been giving himself. And the years had come, 10 of them and counting, each one more whole than the one before. In the summer of 1891, on a hot, clear July afternoon, Jacob went to find Edna after the midday work was done, and found her at the schoolhouse. She went on many Saturdays to prepare for the coming week, because the school had grown to nearly 40 students and the preparation required was substantial. She was at the chalkboard writing out arithmetic problems for Monday, and she did not hear him come in, and he stood in the doorway for a moment watching her. The light came through the south windows and lay across the room in long, warm bars. The smell of chalk and old wood was present. She was writing carefully, the way she did everything, with full intention. Her dark hair, silver at the temples now, was pinned up as always, and she was in her blue teaching dress, and she was 43 years old, and she was the most beautiful person he had seen in his life, which he knew was not an objective assessment and did not care. She turned and saw him and smiled the private smile, the one that was different from the public smile that was just for him. You should be resting, she said. You drove the herd out this morning. The herd is fine, he said. Pete has it. And your knee is fine. Jacob, it is manageable. I wanted to see you. She looked at him with those clear gray eyes. You see me every day. I know, he said. I still want to. She put down the chalk and came to him, and he took her hands in his at the doorway of the schoolhouse where she had been teaching Dry Creek's children for nearly 9 years, and the summer afternoon was bright and hot, and everything was exactly as it should be. Come for a ride with me, he said. To the ridge. To the ridge. She went and got her hat, and they rode out together on Copper and Patience, who were both older and slower now but steady as they had always been. And they climbed the familiar path to the east ridge and came out on top of it in the full afternoon brightness. The view was the same as it always was and also different, the way a thing that has been loved for years becomes different, deeper, more complex, layered with all the times you have seen it before. The shortgrass prairie stretched in every direction, golden green in the summer light, and the sky was the particular enormous blue of West Texas in July, and far below them the roof of the ranch house was visible, red and solid, and the barn was red beside it. You know what I was thinking about, Jacob said. Tell me. That morning, when I found out you were expecting Thomas, I was so afraid. He paused, not of the child. I was afraid of being given something that good when I had been so certain that good things had used me up already. Edna looked at the horizon. And now I think I had it exactly backward, he said. Good things do not use you up, they build you up. The fear was the thing that was using me up. She turned to look at him with the expression that was everything she felt. You did not figure that out alone, she said gently. No, he agreed. I did not. He looked at her. You were the one who was not afraid when I was afraid. You were the one who kept adding to me. Every time I thought I was reaching the limit, you just kept adding. You kept receiving it, she said. That is its own kind of brave. They sat on the ridge for a long time in the afternoon light, side by side the way they always were, his shoulder against hers, her hand in his, the prairie enormous and generous below them. The meadowlarks called in the dry grass. The wind came across the shortgrass in long waves that looked like breathing. 43 years old and 51 years old, on a ridge in West Texas in the summer of 1891, with a life built of hard work and good love and years given back by the simple radical act of being seen. The school below, full of children who knew how to read and think and ask the kind of questions that map who they will become. The ranch below, strong and working, carrying forward the investment of decades. A son who was becoming a man who could be trusted with the morning rounds and a daughter who wanted to be brave enough to eat snakes. 4 hands who had stayed and 2 who were new and a kitchen that smelled of baking on Sunday afternoons. And 10 years that had not been inevitable. That had been a gift, extended by a woman who had paid attention. "I love you," Jacob said. It never needed preamble. It never needed context, it just needed saying. "I love you too," she said, "every morning." "Every morning," he agreed. The sun moved west in its slow arc. The prairie held its quality of deep quiet, not silence, but the particular quiet of a place that has been lived in well, full of the sounds of things going on as they should. A hawk rode a thermal above the south pasture. Copper and Patience stood together at the flat top of the ridge, ears relaxed, comfortable in their proximity. They rode back down as the afternoon light began to mellow toward evening, and the ranch came up to meet them the way a home does: the gate, the yard, the barn, the house. The lamp was already lit in the kitchen window, which meant Mabel Dawes had been by and started supper, because Mabel had a sense for these things. Through the barn door Thomas could be seen talking to Diego Alvarez about something with his characteristic intensity, hands moving, and Diego was answering with the patience of someone who respected the question regardless of who asked it. Clara was on the porch in the last of the light, reading. She looked up when they rode in. "Mama," she said, "the roadrunner came back, the one that nests by the east fence. I saw it eat something." "Brave bird," Edna said, dismounting with the ease of a woman who had been riding her own horse for 8 years. "Very brave," Clara confirmed and went back to her book. Jacob put the horses up and came in to wash, and the kitchen was warm and full of good smells, and the table was set for 5 because Mabel always set a place for herself, and when they sat down it was the way they always sat down. With Thomas talking and Clara listening and Jacob at the head of the table in the chair, worn to exactly the shape of him and Edna across, and the lamp between them and the evening coming in at the windows, and the night being the kind of night that is its own closed and sufficient world. Jacob looked at all of it, at all of them. At the woman across the table who was listening to Thomas, explained something about the new calf with the full, genuine attention she gave to every single thing she ever listened to. 1 good season left, he had thought. That was the honest accounting of a man who was measuring himself against the diminishing returns of the years, and she had arrived and added 10 more. 10 years of mornings on the ridge in medicine, taken as prescribed, and children born into good air, and the school growing, and the ranch strengthening, and the long quiet evenings by the fire with her reading and him reading, and the sound of the prairie outside being the sound of everything they had built together. He was not done. He was nowhere near done. He was 51 years old and his body was not young, and his knee would always give him an opinion about rain coming in. But he was alive in every sense of the word, alive in the way that requires something from you, that makes demands, that pulls you forward into the next morning with something to do and something to love in the doing of it. "Jacob," Edna said, and he realized she was looking at him with that knowing expression. "You are 1,000 miles away. I am right here," he said. "You are thinking something." "Always," he said. "Tell me later," she said, and passed him the bread, and he took it, and the evening settled around them like the answer to a question no one had needed to ask out loud, because the answer was here, in this room, at this table, on this land. in this life that had been given more time than it had thought it had, and had used every last good minute of it. The lamp burned steady in the kitchen window of the Weston ranch. Outside, the summer night was full of stars, the enormous West Texas kind, and the prairie lay quiet and breathing in all directions. And somewhere on the east fence the brave roadrunner settled in for the night, and the cattle moved in the lower pasture, and the grass went on growing the way grass does, without needing to be told. And at the table, Jacob Weston reached across and took his wife's hand for no reason in particular except that it was there and he was grateful for it. And she turned her hand and held his back, and Thomas kept talking, and Clara kept reading her book she had brought to the table despite the rules about books at the table, and the night came fully in and held them all. There were more mornings coming. Jacob was certain of it. More mornings on the ridge with the light moving across the grass like something alive. More calving seasons and branding seasons, and summers and autumns. More years of watching Thomas grow into the rancher his instincts were pointing him toward, and more years of watching Clara become the person her bright, fierce mind was designing. More evenings like this one, in the lamplight, with her hand in his. More and more and more. He had thought he was at the end. She had turned up and shown him he was not even close.